I would like to share a story from when I was younger to hopefully not only teach others to be careful, but to let them know that things will get better. I'm an adult now, well into my 40s, and quite happy where I'm at. But my life wasn't always that way. My childhood was filled with plenty of stressful and hurtful days. I barely knew my dad, and he seemed to have no interest in getting to know me, and my mom just about put everyone and everything over me. It was normal for me to only eat at school. Thankfully, I got free meals, but I would often have to fend for myself at home. As I got older and had a voice for myself, my mother and I often got into fights. It's not like she tried to do right. She didn't work, she made money in other ways, but I rarely saw it regardless of how she earned it. The men that she was with rarely lasted long, but there was one guy that she liked to frequently bring home, and he gave me the creeps with how he would watch me. So when we got into a fight about him being in my room one day when I came home, I wasn't really surprised when she kicked me out, taking his side over me. I tried calling my dad, but he made up every excuse to not let me stay with him. So, there I was, at the age of 17, kicked out and homeless. Now, of course, hindsight is 20/20, and I'm sure some people might have taken me in if I talked about it, but unfortunately, in my already fragile mind, I didn't talk much to the few friends I had about my situation. I didn't want to burden someone else or have them pity me. I enjoyed my time with my friends because it was an escape. It made me feel like my life was normal and I didn't have to focus on it. So, instead, I went to school as normal. I stayed at various friends' houses on the weekends and would shower there, but at night, I floated around a lot and found myself couch surfing at almost complete strangers' houses. I wasn't always lucky enough to find a home to stay at. Sometimes I even stayed in abandoned or closed up buildings. But I could at least find the silver lining in this. I grew to quite enjoy Urbex, and with my free time, I would often try to find new places to explore. At least it sounded cooler to say that I was exploring, rather than trying to find a place to sleep for the night. Mostly I found old houses that were boarded up, and clearly not being lived in. There was one place that I quite enjoyed because they left a lot behind, including an old journal or diary. I kept going there until I finished it because it was so well written. It was almost like a book, and I didn't want to put it down. But once I was finished, I left it there where it belonged, in its home. After all, I knew what it felt like to be ripped out of your home. When it started getting cooler at night, I tried to find better covered places to keep warm, as I was located near the coast of Florida. This is what led me to that position. I had walked past this building several times that I believed was an old clinic. I'm not sure if it was for people or a veterinarian clinic. There was a large sign out front showing it was for sale, and from what I could tell from the outside, it was definitely vacant. I wanted to try and get in to not only have a place to stay, but to also look around. Old clinics and hospitals were always a lot of fun to explore. Between the random tools or supplies that may have been left behind, and just exploring the rooms and imagining what may have occurred in them, it was always amusing to me. I waited until it was darker and then walked around the building, looking for the best way in. It wasn't going to be as easy as a back door to an old house, but at the same time, it kind of was. I prayed that there wasn't an alarm set on in the building, picked up a nearby decorative rock, and broke out one of the office windows. I carefully climbed in and noticed immediately that the heat was still on. It was nice, but also put me on edge, thinking there probably was an alarm and I needed to be ready to run. I looked around the room that I was in, and it still had a desk pushed to the corner, with a cheap metal chair stacked on top of it. There was a shelf on the same wall with random papers and wires being held. I was surprised to see two thick cables on it, which appeared to be some kind of power cord. While cell phones were a thing, smartphones certainly were not. But the plug-in told me this wasn't for a phone. I quickly wrapped them up and tossed them in my bag, hoping that whatever it was for, maybe I could make some cash off of it. That was about all that was in that room. So I opened the door and headed out of the room. It was clear walking down the hall that this place was pretty well gutted. The light covers had even been removed, leaving the bare halogen tubes. All the signs and photos that once hung on the wall were gone, leaving slightly discolored paint. There were a few small pieces of paper that were taped to random doors and walls with painter's tape that I can only describe as being some kind of worker's instructions. I walked over to what would have been the front desk and saw that there was still a nice chair behind it. I sat in the chair as I checked all the drawers, once again not finding much. There were a few stickers and coasters in the bottom drawer, a pen, a small notepad, and just some kind of lanyard. All in all, it wasn't too exciting at that point, but it was also a decent place to stay for the night. I ended up in another room, most likely an exam room, but it was filled with a lot of random stuff, including one of those exam beds you would sit on waiting for the doctor. The cushion was split open and the bottom looked damaged, which was probably why it was left behind. After putting some weight on it, and it's not collapsing under me, I decided to call that my bed for the night. I tried getting settled in, and with the wind-up flashlight that I had with me, tried reading some of the book that I had. But as I lay there, I started hearing a faint sound. A voice. It was very muffled, but I could definitely tell that it was someone talking. I was worried at first, thinking that it was probably the police, possibly being alerted to some kind of silent alarm. But going by my past experiences, they weren't very quiet about it. They always made their presence known, and very loudly at that. This person was clearly talking quietly, like they didn't want to be heard. Maybe it was someone like myself. Someone just looking for a place to stay, and normally I would just leave them be if so, but part of me said that I should go check it out, for both of our safety. So, I left the room that I was in, taking my backpack with me just in case. And I tried to make my way towards the voice. I could tell I was at the right room because I could clearly hear the voice now. They were still mumbling, so I couldn't make out what they were saying, but what I could understand was the loud crash. It made me jump in place, but then I peered into the room as the door wasn't closed all the way. There was a man standing in the room, alone. He would say something and then would swing the pole in his hand, smacking at whatever was in front of him. It looked like he had one of those IV stands. He was swinging it furiously at anything in the room, breaking it and watching it fly across the room. The only thing I was ever able to make sense of when he was screaming was, "It's all your fault." I stood there frozen in place and continued to watch. He lifted the pole over his head, took a deep breath, and then paused. I held my breath in that moment, worried that he knew I was there. Then, in a soft, almost inaudible voice, he says, "Don't worry, I don't want to hurt you, but it's best you get out of here before midnight, before he comes back." And with that, he took another deep breath, screamed, and the pole came crashing down on whatever was in front of him. I wasn't going to wait around to see what happened at midnight or who he was. I slowly stepped backwards, and then ran to the lobby. I thought that I would try the front entrance this time, hoping maybe I could unlock it so that I didn't have to go through the window. But to my surprise, the door was actually cracked open slightly. I know it wasn't like that when I got there because I remember looking at it and thinking it was definitely going to be locked. Was it opened by the man I just saw? Or was there another person there with us? The thought of being alone with that guy was scary enough for me, but possibly two of them, that made it worse. Why did he seem so angry? What did he mean by "it's your fault"? And why was it so important that I be gone? To be honest, none of those questions were very important to me at the time. I slipped through the door and ran until my legs were about to give in. While nothing did happen to me that night, I still feel incredibly lucky. That man gave me a warning, but I had no idea why. I still wonder at times who he was referring to, the importance of the time, and how he even knew I was there, between the breaking and the screaming. I ended up going to a friend's place the next day, swallowing my pride, and finally telling them the truth about my life. From then on, I wasn't on the streets and things did get better. They weren't perfect, and still weren't easy, but I at least didn't have to explore to find a place to sleep. Now as an adult, I can do it for fun and be assured that I have real life skills that keep me safe when I go through with it. Just keep in mind, if you are an explorer, that sometimes people aren't there for a hobby, and some may defend what little they have. For as long as I can remember, I've been plagued by a recurring dream. It always seemed to start the same. It seemed to be through my own perspective. I was walking down a gravel road surrounded by tall wheatgrass swaying in the wind. In the distance was an old farmhouse. It was a powder blue with white shutters. There was a white swinging bench on the covered porch, with a large welcoming wreath on the door. The walk was always the same. I whistled as I walked, all the way up to this house, climbed the worn wooden steps, and opened the door. As I entered the home, I would get this sense of familiarity washing over me. I knew this place intimately, and I felt safe in it. The inside was decorated in a style that I could only describe now as pioneer. As a kid, I used to just describe it as old or grandma-like, even though my grandmother's home looked nothing like it. The furniture was all simple wood. The shelving, the tables and chairs, and even the base of the couch. There was an old and bulky cast iron stove in the kitchen and lots of metal cups all around. The couch and the bed all had what looked like homemade quilts draped over them, and it all just looked cozy. The more I was in this house, the more the sense of home and pride grew. It was as if I built this place and I knew it inside and out. As mentioned, all of this I've pieced together through the dreams I've had. It wasn't until I was a bit older that I started seeing her. I would enter the house, and after hanging up my coat, I would see her, standing by the window, gazing out into the yard. When she would turn and look at me, I got this feeling in my chest that made it hard to breathe. It was bittersweet. I had never met this person in real life, but I knew this woman. And I knew that I loved this woman with every fiber of my being, but when she smiled at me, I'd get this feeling of overwhelming sadness. I always want to approach her and hold her, but I've never seemed to get that far in my dream. Every time I tried to, or tried to say something to her, I would wake up. I whistle, can explore the home and even look at her, but I can never touch her or talk to her. I had this dream countless times over the years. It started with just me walking along the gravel road. Over time, I would walk to the house, then go in the house, and then finally I got to see the woman in the house. I told my parents about it in the past, but I never got into the details. I just told them I kept having a recurring dream about going to this house. They weren't necessarily dismissive about it, but just agreed that it was odd, and since it wasn't a nightmare or disturbing me, we left it alone. I myself thought it was definitely weird. I was also a kid and didn't quite have a grasp on dreams or what they meant. But when I got a little older, like a young teen, I started to become more curious about them. I wanted to know why I had them so frequently, why I seemed to know that house and woman, even though I had never seen either of them. I tried looking into some books on dreams and even stuff online, but the internet and information available to us today wasn't quite the same as it was back in the early 2000s. So more than anything, I just learned to live with it. But then something happened that gave me some answers. In 2008, my family on my dad's side was holding a family reunion. My great-grandmother was turning 99, so they decided to get everyone together as one of the last chances we might have to see everyone together. My parents, myself, and my younger brother were going to be driving to Texas, where the reunion was being held, and where my great-grandmother lived, as well as some other relatives. We had gone to Texas for a small vacation when I was a kid, and met up with my aunt and uncle and cousins. But that was the only time I had been to Texas prior. I was indifferent at the time, being around a lot of people. People I didn't really know was not my thing, family or not. But I also liked my cousins, so I at least had someone there to hang out with. Spoiler, the reunion was uneventful, but it wasn't bad. Lots of hugging and talking about myself, plus free food, so it worked out in the end. We were just going to be there for the weekend, so Saturday night we were driving around the area where my dad grew up, and he was pointing out places that he remembered or had stories about. Then we hit more of a rural area, and while there wasn't much around, I got that sense of familiarity again. I started looking around, looking for something that would validate that feeling, but the only thing I saw was the gravel road we were on. Yet something was still nagging at me. I asked my parents if we were going to someone's house. My dad looked up at me from the mirror and confirmed yes, saying that he wanted to show us his great-great-grandfather's house. I took a shot and asked if it was powder blue in color with white shutters, and he kind of chuckled and said yeah, and then asked how I knew. I just shrugged and said that I didn't know. A few minutes later, we pulled up to the house from my dreams. There it is, sitting right in front of me. It definitely wasn't in the best condition, like it was in my dreams, but I knew it was the same house. I recognized the road, the porch, and it even had the swinging seat on it still. We pulled into the driveway and I was just in awe. I've read that you can't create places and people in your sleep. Of course, I don't know if that's true or not, but it kind of makes sense, I think. I felt like the place had to exist, but I knew that I had never seen this place before. And my parents' reaction confirmed that. So how could I have dreamt of this place? We sat in the car, and I listened as my dad explained that this house was built by his great-great-grandfather, and it still belonged to the family. When he paused, I started asking him about what the inside looked like, and he said that we could go in if we wanted, so we all got out and walked up the steps, and my stomach started churning. At first I was really nervous, but as we walked into the house, I once again had that feeling of being home. It looked the exact same, minus some furniture and decorations. The house still had some personal items in it, but not much. No one was clearly living there, and it was obvious by the state of the place. But as I stood in the living room, I started telling my parents about the house. I literally said, if I remember correctly, the kitchen was a peach color. I then described the old cast iron stove. I gave directions to the bedrooms and what they looked like. My dad looked completely puzzled, and my parents spoke to each other asking if I had seen pictures or something, but we all agreed that we didn't have any pictures of the place. There was really no way that I would have known, and in such detail, what this place looked like, and what it looked like so long ago. I then told my parents that this was the house I saw in my dreams. that's how I knew about it. My dad thought it was weird and didn't say much about it, but my mom seemed very intrigued by the idea that I had dreamt of this place. On our way home, my mom then asked me more about the dreams I had and if there was anything else I remembered about them. Of course there was, because I was still having them. So I told them everything. I explained how I walked down the path whistling. I explained how I saw the home, and I explained the woman that I often saw. I was trying to gauge my dad's reaction because he wasn't normally an emotional man. His poker face never faltered, but he did answer some questions I had. He asked me if I ever heard of a specific song. I don't know what the song was, but I know it was a gospel song, to which I told him no. Our family wasn't really religious. We didn't go to church, and it wasn't something talked about within our family, but they answered questions that we may have had the best way they could. So basically, no. I had no knowledge of the songs, and I was surprised that my dad did. He started singing the song and color me surprised when I could whistle right along to it. He told me it was a song his great-great-grandfather used to sing. He never met him, but he said his grandparents and parents sang it all the time when he was growing up too. He said that he did remember the house as I explained it, because he was there as a kid. It looked similar with minimal differences, but those details that were changed, there would be no way that I would have known. But one of the craziest parts of this, to me, was the woman in my dreams. When I explained what she looked like, my dad confirmed that that would have been his great-great-grandmother. He explained how she always wore her hair and it was just the same in my dream. Lastly, I explained to them how I always felt when I saw her. Even with my brother teasing me, I told them that I always felt sad, and that she was never able to speak. That's when my dad told me something that was pretty heartbreaking. He said that she had died young, barely into her 30s, from a condition that baffled the doctors at the time. From what he described, and with my mom's confirmation, my mom was a school nurse, she had lupus. Something that's manageable today, but back then was practically a death sentence. It all made sense. I saw her and was stricken with sadness, and I wanted to protect her. It was because she was taken away too soon, leaving behind her husband and 2 very young children. It was all so surreal to me. Why was I having these dreams? Why did it seem like I was my own great-great-great-grandfather? My dad definitely looked intrigued, whether he would admit it or not, and my mom was fully subscribed to this whole situation. She talked about how maybe I was given his memories and thoughts, kind of as a way of storytelling since he wasn't around anymore. But all I could think after that was maybe it was a past life. Maybe that was once me, and I was given another chance to live a long, happy, and healthy lifetime. And that is what makes me not want to waste the time that I have now. I have a fairly short story about this guy that I went on a date with that was sort of weird. It wasn't necessarily creepy or scary or anything, but it was the only date I went on with this guy for reasons soon to be obvious. And it was definitely the weirdest date I have ever been on. Just a note before I start, this story does get a bit sexual, and not graphic, but the guy did say some odd sexual things to me, and some people may not be comfortable with that. So, I guess, content warning. Also, the story is not meant to judge the other person at all. I have nothing against who he is or isn't. It was just the situation that was out there. So, for the sake of the story, we're going to call this guy Dan. Dan was a nice guy. He and I had spoken a couple of times. We were mutual friends with someone that I was around a lot, so we did bump into each other because of that. The few times I talked with Dan, he seemed like a decent person. Friendly, funny, and overall easy to talk to. I wouldn't say we were friends, just acquaintances. And we hadn't had any conversations about anything too deep. Mostly shallow talk about slight mutual interests. I never expected anything more out of it. But then our mutual friend and I were talking, and she said that Dan had a bit of a crush on me. Apparently I had said something the last time we spoke that sparked his interest, and he told her. So she was telling me. You know how that goes. She gave me his number and told me to give him a chance, that he was a nice guy, and that she thought we would be cute together. I relented, decided to take his number, and I sent him a text saying hi and who I was. The conversation was alright. Nothing too crazy. The next day he called me in the morning and he actually asked me if we could go out that Friday night. Like on a date. I figured why not. So I said sure and asked what he wanted to do. He mentioned going to see the new Thor movie, which would have been Ragnarok at the time. I was sort of into the Marvel stuff. I'd seen the other two Thor movies and the Avengers, so again I figured why not. Skip ahead to that Friday, we went to see the movie, and it was a good time. One thing I noticed was that during the movie, Dan was really into it. Like really watching it with some intensity. I thought maybe he was just a diehard Marvel fan, and was just hyped to see the next part of the story, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with really liking something. It wasn't until after the movie that I realized that there was more to it. We got out of the theater and were walking back to our cars, when Dan turns to me and starts a sentence in a very strange way. He says, "Okay, so, you know, I'm not gay, right?" This is such a weird thing to say to anyone, really, especially someone you've barely spoken to. I just kind of nodded and said, okay. To which Dan responded, "Chris Hemsworth is such a good-looking dude." I just nodded and said, yeah, he's a good-looking guy, thinking that his initial statement was just some sort of joke for him to set up saying that Hemsworth was attractive. I don't know, I guess I just thought that maybe he had a strange sense of humor or something. But then he got kind of weird with it. I want to say again that he and I had barely spoken prior to this event. 3 conversations max. So for him to start saying what he was saying was a bit extra. He starts talking about how much he would love some, quote, alone time with Chris Hemsworth. I won't get too descriptive about most of the things he said because they were rather inappropriate, but one thing he said I have to mention. He literally looked at me and told me that he would, quote, let Hemsworth bend him over while he screamed that Chris was his daddy. I can't think of any context where this is something you should say to someone that you're on a first date with. And I'm sure that my non-verbal reaction was not a good one, because he seemed to get angry and once again told me, "I'm not gay." Like, shouting it at me, almost. I hadn't said anything to him after he said that. Just kind of stared at him like, okay. But I guess that set him off. He got irrationally angry, yelling at me that he wasn't into guys, that he was straight. Just yelling this over and over, before finally storming off to his own car without saying another word. I watched him yank his door open, get in, slam it shut, and gun it out of the parking lot without even looking back. I was a bit shocked at what happened, obviously. I don't have any issue with gay people, but I'm guessing that Dan does or did. And I think that he was having some issues with repressed emotions. Part of me kind of feels like him yelling that he was straight was more to convince himself than me. I had no personal thoughts on it either way. After that date, I actually never spoke to Dan again. Not by my choosing. I would have been okay with us being friends, but he actively avoided me. At one point, our mutual friend actually messaged me and asked if something happened on the date, because Dan was super standoffish about the whole thing. I ended up telling her about what happened and said that I was okay with him no matter who he was as a person. She told me that he told her that he never wanted to see me again. I had to just say okay and that was that. I have no idea why I was the person that he hated in all of this. How this was my fault. But for some reason, Dan thought it was. I do hope that he's doing well, and I haven't seen him since 2017. I also hope that he came to terms with whatever was digging at him like that. And if he ever hears this story, I hope he knows that I do agree with him. Chris Hemsworth is an attractive man, and he could definitely have worse taste in men. I was never really the type that believed in the paranormal or reincarnation. I have some friends and even family members that did, but we just agreed to disagree. I'm not even religious. It was just something that I couldn't wrap my head around, I guess. So I chose not to believe it. At least, that was before my nephew Cameron changed my mind. Cameron was my younger sister, Megan's son. He was born a healthy baby, and from what she's told us, she rarely had any issues with him. In fact, he slept so well throughout the night that she would have to go check on him and wake him up. Cameron was her second born too, so she knew what to expect after her first son, so Cam really threw her off. As a baby, he was already very unique. I've seen the normal, curious baby look. When they look around the room and things and people, trying to figure out if they approved or not, if they liked what they saw, and if they wanted to cry or scream for help. But Cam always seemed more perceptive. He would stare at items for long periods of time. There would be little babbles from him, and he would turn his head to the sides, but he honestly looked like he was trying to figure out what he was looking at. The coffee maker, the wind-up dog that bounced around on the floor, the fridge, anything that moved on its own, he seemed particularly interested in. But when he started to speak, it was clear that he was different. By age 3, he was already speaking in full sentences, and asking questions that kids typically wouldn't ask. Like the coffee maker. He asked how it worked, how it got hot. But it wasn't just his intelligence that set Cam apart. Sometimes when he thought no one was looking, I would catch an almost mournful expression on his face that no toddler would have any reason to be wearing. One of the first real inklings we had that something different was going on with Cam was for his 5th birthday. There's this place near us called Science City, and they were having a special showing all about ancient Egypt. Because of how curious and smart he was, Megan wanted to have a small party there so he could explore. I thought it was a great idea because I remember it being a lot of fun as a kid myself. The party was great. Cam seemed to really enjoy the treats and gifts, but he was ready to explore. In fact, he seemed very distracted by all the posters and things about Egypt that were hanging around. But then I got to witness it firsthand. We all started walking through the exhibit, and the way that Cam just studied everything so intently and gently touched things was unlike what you would see a normal child do. He walked around the items almost as if he was inspecting them. Sometimes he looked at pieces with confusion and would shake his head, until we then came across a replica of a pharaoh's throne. Cameron hard stopped right in front of it and was intensely staring at it. It was almost unsettling. I'd been walking with him during the trip, as he liked to cling to me a bit, so when he stopped, I asked him if he liked it, and if he thought it was neat looking. I was not expecting the response that I got from him. "I remember this," he said to me curiously, "but it wasn't shiny. The gold was really old, and the seat was red, not blue." I laughed at first, thinking maybe he had something similar at home, like a toy. Or maybe he saw it on something he watched. But as we all moved through the exhibit, his commentary started to become more specific and more insistent on everything he saw. He had these wild stories about certain pieces that he saw, and how certain tools were used, always using we or I specifically, not them or they. He even gave a detailed description of the mummification process. There was something creepy about hearing a small child explain that, by the way. He really became animated when we came across some hieroglyphs. They had some slabs that had some of them on them, as well as pictures of others, and Cam pointed them out and basically translated them like it was English. Sure, at first I thought he was just making it up, seeing the pictures and explaining it like a picture book, but his translations made sense. Reading the plaques, they matched. He was still struggling with reading, so I know that he didn't read those. So, again, how on earth could he have known any of this? Megan, his mom, was with us at this point, and she gave me a weird look too, like she didn't have any answers either. One of the last things we saw at the exhibit was towards the end. It was a display about Tutankhamun, and when we approached the tomb replica, he looked overwhelmingly sad. He took his bottle of water he'd been carrying and slowly poured some of it on the ground by its feet. Megan immediately grabbed the bottle from Cam and slightly scolded him, telling him that he couldn't do that in there. She tried asking why he did it in the first place, and in his continuous melancholy tone he said, "To show that I loved him. He was my best friend. He wasn't supposed to die so young." We did our best to cheer him up after that, which thankfully didn't take long. We went through a small play area after the exhibit, where he seemed to lighten up a bit too, so the party was back to the light-hearted fun we were all hoping for. But a few days after the party, I was talking to Megan and she told me that, ever since the party, Cameron seemed to be obsessed with Egypt, and everything about it. She said at first some of the details on how he would play were creepy, doing things a child wouldn't do, such as mummifying his toys, but that's what he was doing. So, I started my own research and looked up some things I was curious about. I read up on ancient Egypt, pharaohs, some of their rituals, and I was shocked by what I found. Everything Cam told us about through his little words matched up, even down to him spilling the water. Apparently it's a ritual they did to honor and pay their respect to loved ones and ancestors that passed. They would pour water on the ground, and Cam did that at the King Tut replica. There's no way that he would have known, not only how to do that, but what a libation even was. Megan later told me and others that she strongly believed Cameron was remembering a past life, and she wanted to do anything she could to support him. I, of course, was skeptical at first, but it was so bizarre, and I honestly couldn't provide any other explanation. Megan got him books, shows, whatever she could find about Egypt in hopes of not only getting answers and confirmation, but hopefully giving Cam some much-needed closure. Until one day, Megan called me and explained that when she put him to bed one night, Cam explained to her how his bed was a lot more comfortable than his last bed, which is why he slept so well. She claims he told her that he remembered being surrounded by people he cared for and knew he was going to die, but that he wasn't scared, because he knew he'd be coming back. I couldn't deny it anymore. It had to be true. based solely on the amount of details that he had. After that night, Cameron slowly stopped talking about Egypt and his past life. It was as if learning more and finally talking about his death gave him that closure so he could move on. He remained very curious and always wanting to learn, but he also no longer appeared to have that deep sadness in him. He was a cheery and happy kid, always trying to lift others up with him. And while he may not have those memories anymore, I will never forget such a mind-opening experience. Although I'm a person who believes in the paranormal, I'm also the kind of person who tries to rule out every logical explanation before ruling something as paranormal, because oftentimes, 8 out of 10, there's something logical when it comes to a lot of people's paranormal experiences. This experience I had, I have found no logical explanation for. It traumatized me so bad as a kid, and I remember it in full detail nearly 20 years later. Also, after this experience, I refused to step foot in my dad's house, if I can help it. It's been 6 years since I've been to my dad's house. I'm never going back there again. So, you'll need a small backstory for this. My parents are divorced. Let's leave it as my dad has done some bad things that the court ruled that I wasn't allowed to be alone with him when having visitation, or at any given time. I got visitation with him once to twice a month for 24 hours. The only rule was that my mom had to be there in the room with us at all times. So, a lot of the times we would go to his place and I would visit with him. He lived in a trailer that was once a single wide that was turned into a double wide. And he lived on a 10-acre ranch. Used to be 24, but he sold some of the land. The layout of the place was, the moment you enter into the front door, you're faced with the bathroom straight ahead, and to your right is my dad's room. Then to your left is the living room area, and that had a large window by the front door that looked onto the patio that would let a lot of natural light in. Then there was a counter divider that brought you to the kitchen. There was a hallway with windows that looked into another hallway, which was the added-on part. The first hallway, as you go down to your left, you'll see a bathroom and laundry room. Then straight down at the end was my stepsister's room. Then, to the right of that, there is the opening to the other hallway, which was called the lobby room. As you enter the lobby room, to your left there's another room, and then when you make a right, you will be met with a ton of clutter. Shelves of antique model cars, piles upon piles of paper, old newspapers, old board games, art supplies, a couple of guitars, etc. Then, as you go down the walkway to the very end, there's another bedroom. On the wall to the right, there's a 3 large 2-panel window that sees into the living room and kitchen, and one that is in front of the bathroom and laundry room. This is all very important to the story. Well, this all takes place back when I was around 7 years old. I remember we were visiting at my dad's house this visitation. It was a bright sunny day, in the beginning of summer, so we just decided to stay indoors to avoid the heat. Oftentimes, I would go into the lobby room and go through the board games, especially when I got bored. My dad put on the original Lost in Space show, and my mom, stepdad, and dad were all sitting on the couch in the living room, talking as the show played in the background. So, I got up and headed to the lobby room to see what I could play with. I was standing in front of one of the windows, and it was open, so I could hear everything going on. I started rummaging through the large stack of games, and I remember I felt the temperature drop in the room significantly. I thought it was weird, but I paid no mind to it because I was too focused on going through the games. I remember that I suddenly got this feeling that I was in danger and needed to run for my life. I thought it was weird, and I didn't understand why I was feeling this, but I ignored it, thinking that I was being paranoid for no reason. I remember I found this game with magnets in it, and I thought it looked pretty cool, so I looked up into the living room to ask my dad if I could play with it. Well, I remember as I looked in, all the sound was gone. The TV was quiet. My parents talking had stopped. I don't know how to explain it, but the light in the room seemed dimmer. The colors seemed paler. And my parents, all three of them, were staring straight ahead, not moving or talking. I was so focused on playing with the magnets that it didn't register that this wasn't right. So I just looked at my dad, who was sitting on the couch, and said, "Hey Dad, can I play with this?" I watched him stiffly, almost robotically, get up off the couch and start walking down the first hallway. So I kept following as I would see him through the windows and kept asking, "Dad, can I play with this? Dad, hey, Dad." I would then watch my dad walk down the hall, stiff and robotic, with zero emotion on his face. That feeling of needing to run for my life only got stronger, but I didn't understand why. It was just my dad, so I ignored it and kept going. By the time we both reached the end where the two hallways meet, my dad was gone. I was puzzled, but I thought maybe he was checking on the clothes in the bathroom. So I went to listen in to see if I heard him in there, and suddenly I felt the temperature get back to normal. The color and the light came back into the room, and then I heard my dad say, "What?" for the millionth time. I looked to where I heard his voice, and he was sitting on the couch. I was confused, because it was impossible for him to reach the end of the hallway and get back to the living room, and then back to the couch, without me hearing and seeing him. I just stood there and said, "Hey, how'd you get back to the couch so fast?" He responded, "I didn't leave the couch. I've been sitting here talking to your mom and stepdad this whole time." I nervously laughed and said, "You're funny. I saw you get up off the couch and walk down the hallway." My mom and stepdad then irritatedly replied, "No, he's been on the couch talking to us. He didn't get up at any moment." At this point, I could tell by the tone of their voice that they were not pulling a joke on me, and that they were being serious. I then started to freak out and had a full-blown panic attack, and started sobbing hysterically to the point that one of my sisters had to take me outside to calm me down. To this day, I have zero explanation as to what happened to me that day. And this wasn't the only paranormal encounter I've had at my dad's house. It was the last one that made me never want to go back to his house again, though. The other stories, on the other hand, are stories for another time, if anyone wants to hear them. My dad's entire land has a lot of spiritual activity, but then again, a lot of negative stuff has happened on that land. And it's been in my family for 3 generations. My dad's side of the family is very abusive, and the abuse goes back generations. Also, to just throw in, my dad never turned the AC on unless he had to. It was only 80 degrees Fahrenheit that day, and he didn't really need it. So the temperature drop was not the AC turning on, because it was never on that day.
As a child, there was one house we lived in that I will always call home. My parents lived there when I was born, and we stayed there until I was 14. That was what I knew and all I knew. You figured out all the best hiding places. You knew where each creaky floorboard was to avoid being caught. You could walk through it with your eyes closed. That's how this home was for me. But sadly, my family was not immune to the housing crash. After my dad was laid off and had to accept a lower paying job, they could no longer afford our home, and the only thing we could do, much like many others, was to just leave it. I may have been 14, so while I understood not being able to afford things, it still hurt. I didn't want to leave. That was what I knew. Thankfully, we did stay close enough for me to stay in the same school district, but we definitely downsized. From there, we slowly moved more and more south until we eventually moved from Ohio to Kentucky. Over time, it got easier and I got used to the moving. Maybe it was because I never got attached to a place like I did with our first home, who knows. But then, things have a funny way of working out. My 10-year high school reunion was coming, and now that I was living in a different state, a few hours away, I wasn't intending on going. But then, I saw a girl from my class that I had a huge crush on reached out to me, asking if I was going to be there. She wanted to get together to catch up, and it just so happened that I was single at the time, so I jumped on the opportunity. I took the time off, told my parents I was going back to Ohio. No, I didn't live with them, but I still told them when I left town, and made plans to spend a few days up there. The reunion was fine. I reconnected with some old friends, and got to talk a lot with the girl I mentioned, Jessica. We made plans to meet up the next day, and I headed back to my hotel in a great state of mind, reminiscing about my childhood, when I got that itch to drive by my old house. I just wanted to see what it looked like nowadays, that was all. I was not expecting what I saw. The place still looked abandoned, or again, maybe? There were notices taped to the door, and the 2 big windows in the front were boarded up. It was definitely not being used. I parked in front of the house for several minutes, just looking it over and trying to imagine running around the front yard with my little brother. After sulking some, I got the stupid idea of checking it out from the inside. I didn't know who all still lived in the neighborhood, and I didn't want someone to call the cops, so I knew I couldn't just stay there and walk in. I drove over to the little gas station around the block, parked my car, and walked back. I walked along the sidewalk, down the driveway, and then quickly walked around the back, opening the gate with the rock trick I used as a kid. I don't know why, but I thought I would try the back door, not expecting it to just work, but it did. It wasn't locked, so I stepped in. There was certainly a flood of emotions as I stepped into what was the kitchen. All the hanging cabinets had been ripped from the walls, the wallpaper peeling where they once were. The cream-colored paint now looked gray in my flashlight with streaks of yellow running down the walls, most likely nicotine stains. I will mention that my parents didn't smoke. Everything had dust on it, but some had thicker layers than others, showing me what was possibly last touched or moved. I moved into the living room and saw the giant old entertainment center still in its place. The glass was broken out, but otherwise, it was still standing strong. Made sense. I remember my dad did not want to move that thing. The shiplap walls were starting to warp and splinter near the bottom base like they had gotten wet or damaged. But what I noticed the most in the living room was the smell. It was quite a stomach-churning stench. There was, of course, the smell of mold or mildew, which immediately made me grab my shirt to cover my face. But then there was another distinct smell. It was almost like something rotting, but I couldn't quite determine what it was. At first, I just chalked it up to being the house in general. It pretty clearly had been sitting empty for a while, so who knows what had been left behind and left out to spoil and decay. I told myself I needed to leave, but I couldn't go without first seeing my bedroom. So I walked down the right hall and slowly opened the door. To my surprise, it was the least damaged room. It was empty, as I didn't leave one thing behind of mine, but there was a small pile of what I think was clothing in the corner of the room. I sat in the middle of the floor, again, just taking in the moment before I finally said it was time to go, if not because of the smell alone. As I started to leave, however, I remembered my secrets in my closet. Sometimes I would hide in there and write or draw on the inner wall. It was the one place my parents never looked, so I didn't get in trouble for writing on them. I wanted to revisit my old handiwork, knowing if the house was in this condition, it probably hadn't been painted over. I held my phone with my light on in one hand and pulled open the closet doors with the other. I didn't get to see my old artwork. Instead, crumpled up on the closet floor, I saw a body. By the state of it, they had been dead for some time, which made me realize what that smell was that still lingered in the air. I immediately ran out of the house and got sick in the yard. I had been walking through the house and sat in the same room of a corpse for at least half an hour. That's all I could smell. That's all I could see. Once I gathered myself, yes, I did call the police. I won't say I wasn't scared about getting in trouble myself, because I definitely was. My story didn't sound suspicious at all. Yes, I just came to check out my old abandoned home and found the body, I swear. I would probably think they were suspicious too. I waited at the end of the driveway until police showed up, and I explained to them exactly why I was there and everything I did, everything I touched, and what I saw. They went in, and I slowly saw a few more cars and a coroner van show up. The neighbors across the street ended up watching from their porch too. After some time, one of the cops and a detective approached me and asked me when I used to live there, and I was honest. After a little small talk that seemed like the detective was just trying to keep me calm, he then informed me that looking at the state of the body, as well as the lack of disturbance of the surrounding area, he knew that I had no part in his death or moving the body. He then mentioned he assumed it was probably a squatter or someone looking for a place to sleep, and that they most likely died of an overdose, as they didn't immediately see anything on the body. I think he may have felt sorry for me with the way he handled me, but I didn't care. I was successfully traumatized. I left my childhood home at the age of 14 unexpectedly. I returned just to reminisce, and instead, I was left worse off than what I was. He told me I was free to go and said that they would call if they had any further questions. I did go see Jess the next day, and yeah, I told her about what I did that night too. She was horrified for me, but also excited in a way. She actually quite enjoyed urban exploring, and I hadn't really thought about it at that point, but I guess it's kind of what I did. She suggested we go together sometime, promising me we wouldn't find any bodies. I was willing to do so, but not that time. That image stuck in my head for quite some time. I didn't like talking about bodies and watching related shows. It changes you when you see one in real life. I've definitely gotten a lot better now, where I don't get triggered from watching CSI, but I still hesitate when I go into abandoned places.
I apologize in advance for the long story. I'll try my best to keep it short, but there are a lot of details and a lot that happened over a week-long period. This story takes place almost 6 years ago in 2018. Just to give a little backstory, I sometimes pet sit on the side to make a little extra cash, usually for people that I know. This particular time was for a woman, we'll call her Lisa, who had a usual pet sitter, who we'll call Karen. I knew Karen because I had previously watched her cats a handful of times. Karen was unavailable and asked me to take her place. She told me a little about Lisa and her dog Max, and it sounded like a pretty easy gig. I met Lisa at her house to go over everything, and the house was beautiful. A literal mansion. She told me the house was built in the early 1800s and was actually the original mansion for a very prominent family who pretty much founded the town back in the day. The house was furnished accordingly, with the only updated part of it being the kitchen. It had actual servants' quarters, separated staircases, and an original piano from the house. It gave off a very eerie feeling, but nothing that I thought I couldn't get over. My first day at the house was nothing of note. It wasn't until the first night that I started to feel on edge. I was trying to sleep in one of the spare bedrooms when I could start to hear a creaking noise coming from the bedroom across the hall. It sounded like footsteps, like someone was pacing back and forth. I chalked it up to the house being so old that, obviously, it would have creaks and noises. I continued to try to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I was honestly scared to open my eyes, as I thought I would see some figure looking back at me. The noises continued, but I ended up eventually falling asleep, and woke up the next morning feeling a little less on edge. I asked my girlfriend to come stay with me that night to see if it would put my mind at ease. Something I forgot to mention earlier is that Lisa's husband had died that same year. I didn't know much about it, I just knew that he died. When my girlfriend and I were sitting in the sunroom that night, she was sitting in the lazy boy, and I was on the couch. She randomly said to me, "What did you say her husband's name was? Jeff?" And I said that I didn't know. She never told me. We decided to look it up to see if we could find any information, and we did. We found the obituary based on the last name. Her husband's name was indeed Jeff, and we found that he died in the house. We were immediately weirded out by that. Neither of us had known his name, and she randomly said it. At that point in my life, I was really getting into my spirituality, and things had happened in my past which made me realize that I was sensitive to things that are beyond our understanding. So, although this was jarring, it wasn't necessarily surprising, because my girlfriend was the same way. We moved on from it and continued our night. As we sat there, we started to hear what sounded like music. We thought it was probably a car driving by or something outside. As it continued, we could hear that it was piano music, accompanied by a faint chatter. This is where we started to really get freaked out. There wasn't much we could do at this point, so we just turned up the volume on the TV and ignored it until we went to bed. We tried sleeping in the same bedroom as I had the night before, and I thought because she was with me, I would feel more comfortable. We soon started to hear the same noises I had heard the night before, the footsteps. They only happened as we were trying to lay down. We ended up sleeping in the sunroom, and that's where I slept the rest of my time at this house. For some reason, I felt more at ease there. Probably because 3/4 of the wall were completely windows, and it felt separated from the rest of the house. The footsteps and music continued nightly, and I continued to feel more uncomfortable, and could never shake the feeling of being watched. I soon would realize why I had that feeling. I had just gotten back from walking Max, and I had a smoothie in my hand. I walked into the dining room and went to set it on the table, but it fell. I quickly bent down to pick it up and stood up to see a woman standing directly in front of me. I couldn't make out her face, but she was dressed in a long dress with a white around-the-waist apron and wearing a bonnet. As fast as she appeared to me, she was gone. I stood there for a moment just trying to grasp what I had seen. I tried reasoning with myself and saying that it was just in my head, but I know what I saw. Clear as day. I can still picture her 6 years later. I figured the house was probably filled with spirits of the family and servants from all those years ago. Although nothing physically happened to me in that house, the feeling that I was left with is one that I think I will always remember. So, a few months back, before I came to this trade school for culinary arts, I did work readiness classes to see what trades I would like to learn and such. Anyways, about 3 weeks in of a 6-week program, one day I was taking a nap after the school day, and I heard my bathroom door, my dorm room door, and my closet door all shake. And then I hear, "Get the F out." And I had the suite all to myself. No roommates nor suite mates. And the thing is, this trade school was a military hospital during World War II. And something even more spooky had happened before that. A few months prior to that, I did a behind-the-wheel class to get my license, and halfway through the program, I'm taking a nap, and then woke to see a student and staff faces that I met before, but something was off and odd about them. They were the faces of students and staff, people that I've met on campus, like I said, but they had a glow around them, and they were wearing a different timelines kind of clothing. One was a nurse, and one was a soldier with blood. I said, "What the hell? How'd y'all get in my room? I'm sleeping, get out." Then one of the students turned around to look at me, and then turned his head and walked into my dorm room sink's mirror and vanished. I woke up shaken and made sure my door was locked. Now, when I did see the faces, I couldn't seem to move until they were gone. Anyways, fast forward to this point, I wake up randomly at night feeling watched. Even though I changed dorms, this school is definitely haunted. I feel like it's a mix of evil spirits and good ones. To that, I'd mean that they don't mean any harm. Yeah, that's all I have to share, and thank you for reading my story. I don't know that this is a story, but I'm sure that it is a past life remembered. It happened 30-ish years ago, when I was aged 42 or 43, so not a child. I was visiting a friend and his TV was on a history channel. The program was about the American Civil War, and neither of us were paying much attention to it. A photo was shown of Richmond, Virginia. I said instinctively that the photo was wrong. The commentary then said that the photo was some years later, and that it looked different than the time they were talking about. My friend asked me how I knew, and my reply was that I had penciled at the battle they were talking about. I have never wanted to visit the States. One boss that I worked for asked me to fly to Seattle to analyze a client's problem, all paid, but I refused, telling him to get photos instead so I could see from them. I brushed off my comments to my friend as a joke. He knew that I had no plans of going to the States. Looking back, it was as if I was afraid to go there. The door was opened, and I started dreaming about my life as a soldier in the Army of America, wearing a dirty gray uniform, and my death. I remember being shot, the pain, and wanting to die. I wasn't afraid to die, and I'm not in this life. The dreams are different to normal dreams. In my normal dreams, I'm more of a spectator. In my special dreams, I am more present, experiencing the emotions in the dreams. I'm now 70 years old, and I'm sure that when I leave this life, I will be going home. And then later, I'll be coming back to Earth for some reason or another. I'm British, and served in the British Army in BAOR, and the Troubles in Northern Ireland. During action, I was never afraid. It was as if I knew that I was not going to die there. Does any of this make sense? I think I may know what shadow figures are. For some background on who I am, I'm around 30, and I have Asperger's if that matters. For a long time, I've had night terrors on and off randomly, often seeing shadow figures but not really remembering much about them. My night terrors always happened when I was falling asleep, or only an hour or two in to sleep. I no longer have, or have way less night terrors, and have not seen a shadow figure in a long time. So what changed? I now sleep with an eye mask. Now, I'm not going to say that shadow figures are just sleep hallucinations. It's possible, but not what I believe. What if shadow figures are beings that exist only in the dream, but they need eyesight to manifest? Think like if a fire elemental were to be real, it would need a constant fuel source to stay alive. Maybe this is crazy, but who knows, since so little is known about sleep and dreams.
My brother, we'll call him Frank, has been doing urbex or urban exploration for years now, and took me along with him to an abandoned school. Not to shit on the area, but the whole place looks straight out of Fallout 4 or any other apocalypse games. There are a lot of abandoned buildings, crime, and we'd have to watch our backs while we were there. I did a quick YouTube search and there have already been videos posted of this location. We arrived by car and he cleared up some rules. 1, the moment he says to leave, we get out of there immediately. 2, take nothing when we're in there. 3, if it looks unsafe to walk on, don't try it in case you fall through. And last but not least, 4, keep your mouth covered because black mold is dangerous. Without elaborating, he got out of the car with his GoPro ready, and we walked in through a side entrance. It was pretty dark, but with some of the windows broken, there was some light coming in. Seeing all the abandoned classrooms was pretty unnerving. Not in a kids could easily come back here right now way. It was too dirty and damaged for that. But out of the norm, everything had dirt on it, and we went into one room. He gestured for me to stop when we saw an old, disgusting mattress laying on the floor in the corner. There was garbage around in a bucket that I think would have been used as a toilet. We were curious but careful. Together, we walked to the mattress, and I saw another video of some boys in Brazil, I think, who found a dead body. We didn't. We found an old blanket, some food, and a backpack filled with random things. We agreed it was probably a homeless person, but with the amount of dust, they haven't been here for a long time. But why would they leave their backpack here and not take it with them? We continued down and went into the library. It was dark down here and we needed to rely on light to see. There were still some shelves filled with dust-covered books, except a single corner, where there were a pile of burnt books that stained the walls with char. They could have used it during the winter to try to keep warm. Frank and I left until we came to another room when we heard shouting and people running through. He put his finger up, gesturing for me to be quiet, and we hid until the noise died down. We couldn't go back the same way we came, so we had to find a different way out. We went down the hallway and found a pile of cards. We thought they were just old student IDs that were left behind, but they were social security cards, driver's licenses, and other important information that people wouldn't willingly leave behind. We looked at each other and found a pile of old clothing, different sizes, men's and women's clothing, bras and panties, and some pieces were covered in blood. Some were dark brown and others a lighter shade of red. Strangely, there were no shoes, and I found one thing that scared me. A baby onesie with a blood stain on the chest along with a hole. I nearly started screaming, and he had to give me a shake to get me to shut up. He pointed for us to leave, and after seeing this, he didn't need to tell me. We opened the door, and seeing the sun outside felt like stepping out of hell. I tried to talk to him, and we ran toward the car, getting in and driving away to escape. When he sped away, I saw a group of people watching us through the windows, and it made the experience all the more terrifying. We stopped at a gas station, and he called the police to tell them what we had seen. I was still shaking and looking out the windows to make sure we weren't followed. Were they murder victims or people who were trafficked? I don't know. The whole place gives me the creeps, and now I don't want to go back somewhere dangerous like that again. Frank wants to go back to see if the evidence is still there. He tried looking up the names of some of the pieces of ID, but it was too water damaged or blurry to see the faces or names properly. So maybe there is a chance they could be missing people, but if their ID is there, where are they? And who would leave that behind? Anyways, I hope you enjoy it, Raven. Take care.
Hey, Raven. I've got a story to share, and it's one of those moments that just sticks with you. You know, sometimes kids say things that completely throw you off guard. Well, this one really shook me. It happened with my daughter, Lily, when she was about 6. It was one of those innocent moments that turned into something I'll never forget. It was a normal afternoon, and Lily was sitting on the couch with a book in her lap. She's always been bright, you know. She was reading so well for her age, and I was just bursting with pride. So I sat down next to her and said, "Lily, you're so smart, and I'm so proud of you." She looked up at me with those big eyes of hers and gave me a little smile. And then, completely out of nowhere, she says, "I died in a fire last time, but I wasn't a witch, Mummy. I was just smart." I froze. I wasn't sure that I'd heard her right at first. I mean, what kind of 6-year-old says something like that? I laughed a little nervously and asked, "What did you say, honey?" She didn't even hesitate. I wasn't a witch. And people thought that I was because I knew things, but I was just smart. They didn't like that. It was the way that she said it. So calm, so matter of fact. Like she was telling me what she had for breakfast or something. My heart started pounding in my chest, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "What do you mean, sweetheart? Where did you hear that?" She looked up at me, her face in a serious way that didn't match her 6-year-old self, and said, "I remember. I lived in a little house with a garden and I could read, just like now. But people didn't like that I knew things. They thought I was doing magic." I just stared at her completely speechless. She wasn't making this up, and there was no hesitation in her voice. No signs of imagination running wild. It felt real. Too real. I swallowed hard and asked, "What happened then, Lily?" She looked down at the book in her lap, like she was thinking about it, and then said, "They burned me. They thought I was making their corn die, but I wasn't. I was trying to help. The fire was really big and I could hear them shouting, but it didn't hurt for too long. I floated away before it did." I felt this chill run down my spine. I didn't know what to say, and honestly, I didn't want to ask any more questions. It was like I'd opened a door that I wasn't ready to walk through. I hugged her tight, kissing the top of her head, and held back tears that were trying to escape. Lily went back to reading, completely unbothered, while I just sat there, replaying her words over and over in my head. I tried to tell myself that it was just her imagination or maybe something she'd overheard somewhere, but it felt different. Like she was telling me something from another life. I didn't know what to make of it. Later that night, as I was tucking her into bed, I asked her again, "Lily, where did you hear that story?" I was curious on one hand and wanted to protect her innocence from whatever or whoever was telling my little girl these things. She's much too young to be introduced to those horrible historical times yet. She looked at me with a small smile and said, "I didn't hear it, I remembered it. But don't worry, Mummy. This time I won't tell anyone what I know. It's safer that way." I kissed her goodnight, but I couldn't sleep after that. I kept thinking about what she said. How could a 6-year-old come up with something like that? How could she know about something so vivid? So specific? It's been a while since that day, but I still think about it sometimes. Hello. The story I'm about to tell you, I haven't told anyone. Not even my husband. Not because we're not close, but because nobody that I am close to would believe me. Or at least, that's my fear. Not to mention, this story is close to my heart, so the thought of someone I love taking this for anything less than the truth is not something I'm willing to do. Anyways, here goes. I've always loved everything British. I love the culture. I love learning everything there is to know about past royalty and fashion, music, films, their beautiful accent, everything. Even learning about servants and what it was like to be a commoner. It's been a dream of mine to visit there, a longing I've never put to rest. Now, putting that aside and on an unrelated note, I am a mother to 4 children. They mean the world to me, and my life revolves around them. That is why when my second child, let's call him Calvin, was just a baby, my world seemed to cave in on itself. You see, from the time Calvin was just a baby, something felt wrong. I feared that I was going to lose him. He was healthy and smart and perfect. But for some reason, something I couldn't explain, I couldn't get over this fear. I didn't fear losing my other kids, just Calvin. And I would stay up some nights and just cry, feeling helpless. He was my perfect boy, so please, God, no. This went on for years and ate away at me. Not knowing what to do, why I felt this way, or how to change this feeling in my bones. As he got older, it almost felt worse, because I had already had 2 years with him, and then 3, and then 4. When would this feeling go away? Was I coming closer to the nightmare that I feared? I would take him to the doctor for a sniffle. I would worry if he wanted to ride his bike. I always hid my fear because it didn't make sense, but it was there, quietly whispering to me that Calvin was different. So I did what I could. Everything that I could to secretly make him safe. One day when Calvin was 9, and for reasons unrelated to this, I had a past life regression. I had never had one before and was more curious than anything else. I just thought it would be cool. Well, it worked. I saw myself living in England, sometime in the late 1700s. I was a stout woman with light golden hair. I was not beautiful or rich. I was a poor woman and I washed clothes for others. I had 2 small children, a boy and a girl. I loved them more than anything, and although we didn't have much, I felt happy. We lived in a small cottage by the sea, not a pretty beach and not a pretty cottage. A small, dark cottage by the sea, butting up to many other old shack-like cottages. I would hang clothes right outside the house, though the weather was never great, and the property was small. But I kept it clean, and it was enough for me. I loved my life because I was useful and I got to know people. It made me feel important in the community, even though I knew I wasn't. My place and my worth in the world was little, but I felt content. I felt happy being small. I have no memory of a spouse. I raised my kids with financial help from relatives. Washing clothes wasn't enough. We would walk to the market, my children barefoot and holding a big basket for the meager food we would get. And I would take stew for them. My children grew and we loved each other. Then, one night, my son died in a horrible horse accident. It was the worst day of my life. I was so alone, so distraught. It makes me tear up when I think about it because it's something I can remember clearly now. The son I lost was Calvin, but in my previous life. He looked a little different than he does now, but I felt his spirit and knew exactly who he was. I felt the same familiar love that I have for him now. And in that instant of recognition, it all became clear to me. My fear of losing him was because I had lost him before. I feared for him because I didn't want to lose him again. I wept at that realization. The pieces fell into place, and I knew that I could let that go. He was here again, and I wasn't going to lose him. That past life regression freed me. I never imagined that doing this would heal a wound so deep that it goes back to a different lifetime. I can now live my life in freedom knowing that everything will be okay. And although there are pieces of my old life that I like to think back to with gratitude, I can now move forward in this one. Hi, Raven. I was 12 or 13 when this happened. I was sleeping and it was the middle of the night. I woke up to a door in our house slamming repeatedly. I knew exactly which door it was, and thought it was my oldest brother. He had a temper and it was not out of his normal behavior. I listened a while longer, waiting for it to stop until I got so frustrated that I stormed out of my room. When I got to the living room, I saw the door that I knew was slamming wide open, and there were no lights on. It was obvious nobody was awake. Just as I looked around, my dad came down the stairs muttering something about the damn door slamming. I froze. I asked him if he heard it. He said something along the lines of how could he have missed it, and the radio in the adjoining room started to blare. We made eye contact. We were both terrified. I ran and turned it off and came back to my dad. We stood there waiting for something else to happen, and after a minute or so, he looked at me and said, "Go back to bed, and don't tell your mom or sister about this." The weird thing is, we had dogs and they did not stir. It was like it never happened. I asked him about it once years later and he said that he doesn't remember, but I don't believe him. I closed that door every night before bed for years, and it never happened again. Hi, Raven. This will be my 4th story I've submitted. This has been a huge weight lifted off my shoulders, as I always thought something was wrong with me, but hearing your other stories has made me realize that I'm not alone. I'm interested if you, Raven, have had any experiences in the categories you've read. I'd be interested to listen. Had one that was a glitch story that I put in a video a while back. I actually mentioned that it was by me, and for some reason a lot of people decided to tell me it wasn't a glitch and tear it down, so. Nothing else, no other experiences though, so. You said you had a lot of shadow people stories lately. Well, I'd like to share my first encounter with a shadow person. But in this case, this also includes an angel encounter. This might get graphic, so beware listeners. When I was 5, I had my tonsils removed, and while I was recovering at home, I remember being sent to bed by my mom. My mom left to watch TV with her boyfriend at the time in the living room near my bedroom. I laid in bed and I couldn't fall asleep. something was wrong with my nose. I had blown my nose, and I had not known that I had blood in the Kleenex. I put the Kleenex in the garbage near my bed. I immediately began talking to someone right beside my bed near my head. I was 5 and was happy to see this figure. I even called her sister, but it was not my sister. I remember seeing a light figure, my height, but she had no legs, a body, a head with long hair and wings. I was talking to an angel. She was talking to me in my head. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, and I heard her thoughts in my mind. She was telling me to stop blowing my nose. I looked at her white/blue-hued figure facing sideways from me, and I told her I needed to just one more time. I proceeded to blow my nose in another Kleenex. The angel seemed to bow her head in disappointment and suddenly vanished. Unfortunately, I broke a stitch even more from my tonsils being removed that day from the hospital. I began to feel nauseous. Blood stopped coming from my nose and began draining into my stomach. I remember getting up to the washroom and I coughed up blood. I got scared for my health and immediately told my mom that I was coughing up blood. My mom was sitting on the sofa watching TV, and she instantly sprang up. I told her I felt sick, and then turned to cough up more blood in the sink. I felt better, but my mom grabbed a fuzzy teal blue blanket and scooped me up with it. I remember my mom screaming for her boyfriend to drive them to the hospital. I don't think my older sister was taken with us, but I understand that I was dying and my mom needed to get me to the hospital. I remember being held by my mom in her arms as they drove. She was strong, but obviously upset. I didn't want to worry her further, and I told her, I feel better, we could just go home. My mom said that they would get me to the hospital, and I gave up trying to convince her that I was alright. I didn't know that I was still internally bleeding. My mom's boyfriend zoomed up to the hospital, and I don't remember much, other than the nurses surrounding me on a hospital bed, and needle after needle. I'm still afraid of needles today, but I understand you can't blame the nursing staff. They were trying to save my life. I was crying scared of so many nurses talking frantically and moving fast around me. I remember lying on a hospital bed, content, sleepy, and at peace. My mom was crying beside me on a chair. I looked at my mom and said at 5 years old, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll be okay," and sleepily smiled. Suddenly, I would feel scared again and wanted my mom to pick me up. She did, but immediately I felt nausea and needed to cough up more blood. I ended up needing to get a blood transfusion. The tonsil stitches had gone undone, or something, and I was slowly bleeding to death. The next memory I have is waking up with nurses and a doctor in the room with me again, but I was lying on the hospital bed looking at a shadow man, wearing a trench coat and a square hat from the 40s. He looked to be from a detective show, but he was painted in shadow in a room that was fully lit, blacker than black itself. He towered over everyone else, perhaps 6'8" in height, no features and completely in shadow. The doctor and nurses scrambled around me in a fuss trying to save my life, and did not notice this huge shadow man. I remember at 5 years old feeling completely at peace and not afraid that I was dying. I was staring at the black figure standing in the doorway of the curtains around me, just watching me. I wasn't afraid, and I even smiled at him. No one seemed to notice him but me. The hospital area was in bright lights all around us. There were no shadows for him to hide in. He stood in the light, just completely black. I was getting really tired from what the hospital staff gave me for the operation, and I never saw the shadow man again. Hi, Raven. I have quite a bit for you, so you can use whichever you like. I'm a 32-year-old female, and you can call me Lola. First, let me say that I was raised by my grandparents, and it was a very religious household. They believed spirits and things like that. They had their own experiences. A lot of weird and creepy things happened in that home. Certain areas had very bad vibes. This place is why I learned to trust anytime I got the bad vibes. One thing that happened had actually happened to both me and my sister, we'll call her Tia, at different times, and we never told each other until we were much older. The house had a lot of people in it most of the time. So, when we would get a moment alone and no one was watching the TV in the living room, we took advantage. I had been at a youth group and had just gotten home. The house was quiet. My grandparents were at church and I didn't know where anyone else was. So I just turned the TV on and planned to enjoy it while I was alone. About 10 or so minutes later, I heard my name being called from upstairs. I thought to myself that it was weird because I thought I was alone. I called back and asked what they wanted. They said, "Come here, I need your help." "Help with what?" "Just come here and help me." "No, I'm watching something. I really need your help." At this point, I was grumbling and debating on if I was going to go help them. Then my uncle, who also lived there, came home and he headed upstairs right away. So I asked him to see what they wanted upstairs. I don't even remember whose voice it was anymore, because it was so long ago. He called down after a moment and said that no one was upstairs. I was confused. My sister said the same thing happened to her. There were 3 of us girls, Lena, Tia, and myself, and one boy that my mom had. My sister Lena had been off school for some reason. I don't remember, but she was around 12, so I was around 9. She'd been cleaning the room she shared with our mother and was walking by the bathroom and caught movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned her head and saw a little girl in the bathroom with long blonde curly hair, brushing her hair. The little girl must have felt eyes on her because she turned her head and looked right at my sister with bright red eyes. Lena dropped the broom she was carrying and ran down to my grandma. My uncle was very dependent on alcohol. He had friends who were just as bad off as he was. I don't remember who told this particular friend, let's call him Matt, about the weird things that happened in the attic where my uncle's room was. Well, Matt was very intoxicated and decided he was going to taunt the entity in the attic, and said that they weren't real. He didn't believe in that stuff and that there was nothing there. Well, he went to the steps, about to leave, and was saying his goodbyes to my uncle, and ended up going down the steps, not of his own will. When my uncle asked Matt what happened, he said that as he was saying goodbyes, he felt hands press hard against his back, and he was shoved down the steps by the thing in the attic. I say thing because I always got a really bad feeling from it anytime I went even just near the attic steps. And I had to a lot since my bedroom door was at the bottom of those steps. When Lena was a baby, my mom stayed in the attic with her. One night, my mom woke up to my sister's toys going off. She got up to check on my sister, and Lena was fast asleep. The toy that was making the noise was not within her reach either. I experienced a lot of things in my bedroom. Many times I woke up in the middle of the night to feel someone sitting on the edge of my bed. This wasn't possible because I locked my bedroom at night, and it wasn't the type of lock you could break into without breaking the entire door. At one point, I had a cousin, female, sharing the room with me due to some home issues that she was having. It was another middle of the night, and I woke up to toss and turn for a while, and when I turned to do the main... There were 2 separate sections of my room because it was originally 2 rooms that were turned into 1. I heard a very distinct boy's voice say, "Hello?" I froze. I was the last one in the room at night. I was the last one to fall asleep. I knew the door was locked. I didn't know where the voice came from, and no, it couldn't have been my cousin talking in her sleep. I know her voice, and this voice was out of the range that her voice goes. I also had an Xbox 360 with a Kinect and Just Dance. My much younger cousin always bugged me to play it. So, for one of their birthdays, I gave in and I let them. There were 4 of us in my room. I was sat on the desk next to the TV. The oldest of the girls was sitting next to me on the daybed, and the other 2 were at the wall across from the desk playing the game. If you've never used a Kinect, then you should know that it shows your body as it signifies in a little box on the screen, and your body is shown with a mix of yellow, orange, and red. Again, I remind you that only 2 girls were playing. They were giggling and doing the dances. My cousin that was sitting next to me, and I looked over at the TV to check how they were doing, and I just stopped everything. My eyes widened and I quickly glanced over to my cousin next to me. She had the exact same expression and was seeing what I was seeing. There were not 2 people playing the game, but 3. The random third body was taller than the other 2, had short hair, and very jerky movements just slightly behind the girls' movements. We were confused and didn't mention it to the 2 playing until they were done. Finally, in this room, I woke up so many times with scratches all over me randomly, and various bruises. Most of the places were areas that I could not have done that to myself. I also have a very good sense of smell. I associate certain people with certain smells. In 2015, we lost my grandfather, and this devastated me since he was more like a father to me. In 2017, I moved into my first apartment alone. I had lived in the apartment for a week already and was getting ready for bed. I was walking into my bedroom and stopped dead in my tracks, and I instantly started to tear up. What made me stop was a very specific smell. The very specific cologne that my grandpa wore to church. No one else had been in my apartment for days since we fully moved in. No one else wore that cologne. I like to think that that was my grandpa telling me that he was keeping an eye on me. Last year was a terrible year. I lost my grandmother, had to leave my old apartment after 6 years, and had to move in with someone who made living with them hell. I also lost my younger brother, and then I lost one of my uncles. One morning I was having a conversation with the person I was living with. Let's call her Liz. Liz went over to the bathroom but was still trying to talk to me. So I could hear her better, I walked through the kitchen past the coffee maker into the pantry door, which was right outside of the bathroom. I finished talking to Liz and turned around to go back to the living room and stopped in my tracks right in front of the coffee maker. No one had used it yet that morning. There was no coffee smell when I passed by it just a few minutes before, but standing there now, there was a very strong smell of coffee. Liz noticed that I stopped and she asked me what was wrong, and I told her about the smell. And she came over to where I was and she didn't smell it, and then I no longer smelled it. My grandparents and my brother would drink coffee all day if you let them, so some part of my brain went to them. I had also heard some very heavy footsteps going from Liz's bedroom to the direction of the bathroom. It was very early, around 5 a.m., so I just thought that it was Liz going to the bathroom. Well, less than 5 minutes later, I heard the bedroom door open and Liz comes out to go to the bathroom. So what came out before she did? Final thing from living with Liz, I was home alone. I have a cat and he's a little bit who jumps on the counter and tables to be nosy. I left the bathroom door partially open because he hates it when I close the door on him. I don't know why, but he's been like that ever since my old apartment. As I'm using the bathroom, I hear a very female voice saying, "Shoo, get off of me. Get out of here, move." The voice sounded like she was doing a loud whisper trying to get heard. This confused me. I knew I was alone. The cat even seemed to respond to the voice like he jumped off of wherever he was. I looked forward to see if I saw anyone, and of course there was no one there. My grandpa had his own experiences. Ever since my mom was a little girl, he got used to sleeping in the living room. My mom took over his spot sleeping in the bed for a long time, and he just got used to it. One night he woke up feeling an immense pressure on his chest. He said it felt like he was being suffocated. The only thing he could think to do is pray. Again, they were really religious. Then he said that the pressure went away and he was able to breathe properly. Another experience he had was during a snowstorm. The kids were fairly young and wanted to sleep downstairs that night. It was really early in the morning. The sun had barely been up, and there was a knock at the door. He opened the door to see who it was, and it was a man trying to find refuge from the cold. I should say that my grandparents often helped people out a lot. Their friends, my mom and uncle's friends, and even our friends. They became mom and pop, or gram and pop, to so many people. The only reason my grandpa said he couldn't help the man is because the kids were right there in the living room sleeping, and he was very protective of us. A moment after he closed the door, he felt very guilty, so he grabbed an extra blanket and went outside to give it to the man. But he had vanished. There was no more snow coming down, so he would have seen any footprints left from the man, but there were none. He even went to the alley to see if the man was there, and nothing. It was like the man was never even there. I hope that you enjoyed my weird and creepy life happenings. First of all, hello, Raven. You are such an inspiration to me in so many ways. Thank you so much for all that you do. Thank you as well. I would like to tell you a crazy X story. It might be a little long, so I apologize for that, but it's a real doozy, too. First of all, it was the 1990s, and I was in my 30s. I'm female and I had 3 little kids. I was still living with my ex-husband, and we were living as roommates. Our marriage was definitely over, but we were co-parents figuring out our finances. We rarely saw one another as we had opposite schedules in order to care for the kids. This crazy ex story is not about my ex-husband. It's about a woman that I dated. A dear old childhood friend, let's call her Jane, introduced me to this woman. Jane had known her for years and actually bought plants from her, if you know what I mean. Potted plants. So, red flag number 1. Anyway, my friend said that this lovely lesbian friend of hers was recently broken up and was grieving a long-term relationship. Red flag number 2. Jane thought it would be cute to introduce her 2 lesbian friends. Her friend, my soon-to-be crazy ex, let's call her Ms. T, also had a child. Jane said that Miss T seemed to be a really good mother, and since Jane was a longtime nanny, how could I argue? I really focused on the fact that Jane had known her for years, and that she felt she was a good mother. This is how we get past those red flags. We only focus on the best parts, the ideal or even potential of a person rather than what is really standing there in front of us, right now. And people will tell us who they are, but we have to be willing to truly listen, to pay attention and see. So, we made arrangements to meet. And because I was basically new to town and new to lesbian culture as well, Ms. T offered to take me out and show me the town. I was very excited to meet new people. It had been a very long time for me, 10 plus years since I had dated, and even longer since I had dated women. When I met Miss T, I was already crushing on her because of the things Jane had told me about her. But then when I saw that she had brown eyes, those deep, dark brown eyes that you can get lost in, you know what I mean. I was a lost cause. Anyway, consistent with lesbian culture, Ms. T and I hooked up that night. Another thing that was really cool about Miss T was that she had the most beautiful ficus tree growing in her bathroom. It was fragrant and gorgeous. I actually fell in love with that plant that night. And did I fall in love with Miss T? Well, that first night was underwhelming. But that didn't really matter so much to me. We became very close very quickly. Miss T told me a lot about her ex, like a lot. About how she was abusive towards her, her ex would beat her ex was an alcoholic, and her ex would manipulate her. Red flag number, 5? I did see her around her child, and she did seem to be an attentive mother, and that really speaks volumes to me. So, I focused on that. Within a week or two, we were doing things together with our kids. I know, not a good idea. It was about this time that she told me that she was also an alcoholic, but that she had quit drinking and she was going to AA. She said she hadn't had a drink in several months since the breakup with her alcoholic girlfriend. She blamed her alcoholism on living with an alcoholic. As you might have guessed, she was still drinking in secret, and I was naive or dumb enough or willing enough to look past that and continued having a relationship with her. Well, the first night we spent together might have been underwhelming, but with time, my enthusiasm and her experience was a good combination. It was about 8 months in that an incident happened that caused our breakup. Things had not been going very well at all. She'd been openly drinking, she'd been manipulative, she had cheated on me and lied in this short time we had been together. Even so, I was still giving her the benefit of the doubt, as she seemed to be trying to improve herself, and she seemed to be genuinely sorry after outbursts that she would have. Plus, I decided that I loved her, and I knew that I was a good person, and a good person supports those we love, right? Now, if you haven't figured it out already, I should give you a trigger warning here because there is a description of domestic violence ahead. One night, we had decided to sit home and watch TV. My ex-husband and I traded childcare duties, and he would kindly take Miss T's kid along with ours so Miss T and I could have some adult time. On this night in particular, when the incident occurred, it started with drinking. She'd begun drinking out in the open, saying that she wasn't an alcoholic after all. She just used to drink a lot because she had to drink to get along with her alcoholic ex. However, I didn't know at this time that she was drinking a whole lot more than she had led me to believe. I had never been around alcoholics or drug addicts, as I was raised in a very strict religion. Me and my family were all teetotaling, pious members of the community. By the end of the night, she was drunkenly screaming and wailing about how unfair life had been to her. After a while, vocalizing wasn't enough. We were out in the front yard of her house, where I had followed her because I was trying to talk her out of shooting herself. Yes, she had a gun, which she dropped in the grass before she began to punch me. Now, I'm a scrappy bee. My family may have been teetotaling Christians of high regard, but I can tell you that I learned to turn the other cheek. My interpretation of that Bible verse was that if they hit me once, I would turn the other cheek, or let them hit me again. Then I would take them out. Growing up in the 1980s with brothers meant my survival depended on being able to throw down. If I'm not being clear, I could fight, and I did fight while growing up. However, this was my girlfriend. I chose not to hit her back, and I offered up my left arm for her to punch. Instead of fighting back, I just defended myself with the left. By the time the beating was over, my left arm looked a lot like hamburger meat. You know how you can form hamburger meat? Like, you can pinch it and it stays in that shape? My arm was like that. It literally took over a month before it was no longer discolored, and it still aches to this day. I then called Jane to come get me after the beating was over. When she asked me what happened, I threw up in her car. I hadn't been drinking. Sometimes our bodies want to reject something that happened, and we end up rejecting the last thing we ate along with it. I'm sorry to say that there were 2 other similar events that happened after this one before I actually officially got out of the relationship again. Broke up with her and didn't get back with her. Once I finally truly ended things with her and refused to react or return her calls, or anything, well, that is when things got really crazy. She began to stalk me. Everywhere I went, she was there. She was there at my workplace. She was there at the 7-Eleven when I went to get gas. She was at church. She was talking to my friends, all of them. She was calling my family, all of them. She was telling everybody that I was an alcoholic, that I was abusive, and that I beat her. She was crying to them and begging them to convince me to talk to her, to take her back. And then she would go back to bad-mouthing me. She apparently wrote my therapist a letter telling the same stories about me that she had told my friends and family. She'd actually taken everything that happened between us and turned it around. Here's the thing. People believed her. I hadn't been saying anything. I was ashamed and embarrassed, humiliated, and afraid, and so I hadn't even told anybody what was going on, except for my closest friend and my ex-husband and my therapist. So when people only heard her side of the story, and she was very convincing, they believed her. People didn't even ask me for my side of the story. Why would they? I had been painted as a monster, and really, to be fair, I didn't feel like telling everybody everything. Miss T continued to stalk me, often with her kid in tow. She was literally everywhere that I was, and I couldn't figure out how she always knew where I would be. We didn't have cell phones back then. Some people had pagers. I didn't have a pager. I did have a landline. Ms. T happened to be in communications as an officer in the Army, and she had used government equipment to bug my phone. I didn't know this at the time. These are things that I found out later. She was also giving drugs to and paying a person that was in my group therapy to report back to her what I said in group therapy. So, the stalking continued for many months. Christmas was the worst. On Christmas Eve, while my kids and I were out caroling, Miss T went to my next-door neighbor's house. By this time, I lived in a place with just me and the kids. Miss T told my neighbors that I was moving out, and that she was there to help me move, and asked if they could please watch her kid while she helped me. They agreed. She then proceeded to break into my house, and over the course of 4 hours or less, she had moved much of me and my children's stuff out of the house, including furniture, clothing, toys, presents, stockings, dishes, blankets, towels, sheets, paintings, curtains, money, checkbooks, the landline. She threw the Christmas tree in the ditch. You get it. She was the literal Grinch. She went as far as to break the thermostat so that we couldn't heat the house. She had attempted to start a fire using some kind of liquor as an accelerant. It was beyond awful. We stayed in a homeless shelter that night as it was one of the coldest nights of the year. She didn't serve any time for that because, well, mainly because her grandfather was a well-known attorney at the time in that town. Almost a year had passed since the breakup, several months since the theft. The police were unhelpful. There really was nothing that they could pursue or do anything about that they hadn't already done. Until one afternoon when I was getting out of a car with a friend, we'll call her Lynn and her pit bull. I had exited the car and just begun to lock the door when Miss T jumped out of a tree with the buck knife in her hand. If you don't know what a buck knife looks like, you should look it up. It's a great big hunting knife used for skinning deer. It's long and has a razor-sharp edge, and then it moves up to a serrated edge. So, anyway, when she jumped out of the tree, she landed right behind Lynn, who had just let her pit bull out of the back seat. Miss T grabbed Lynn, arm across Lynn's chest, and held the knife to her throat. Her dog had run away. Lynn dropped to the ground and rolled out of the way, and then ran into the house to call 911. That left Ms. T facing me with her knife still in hand, screaming, "I'm gonna kill you, B. I'm going to effing kill you." At that moment, a different kind of scream came from me. A primal scream. I've never heard anything like it before or since, not from anyone. It wasn't a high-pitched scream, it was more of a roar but with words. The words were, "Call 911." At that point, everything seemed to be moving in slow motion. The look on Ms. T's face was sudden, utter fear. Within seconds, people were out on their porches all over the neighborhood, all up and down the street with cordless phones. Police were on the scene within minutes. They found Ms. T's truck parked around the street. She wasn't in it, so they just waited. They picked her up, and at that point, with several witnesses and numerous calls into 911, I was able to press charges against her for attempted murder. I think she took a plea bargain or a lesser charge. I'm not sure what it was, but she basically got 14 years of parole. She didn't serve very much time. I think maybe a few months. After she got out of prison, she began to stalk me again. So I called her parole officer. I told him that if I saw her again, I would report her to the police, and at that point she would be facing 14 years in prison. She stopped stalking me, or at least I stopped seeing her. So that's my crazy ex story. It's pretty bad. And that's why it had to be so long. It was terrible. Here I have only written the main parts. Miss T was diabolical, abusive, manipulative, and a serious alcoholic. There were several other incidents, including her slamming on her brakes so that the person behind her would hit her. I also came to find out that I was not the only person she was stalking. The woman who had been spying on me for her in my group therapy got sober and did confess and apologize. When I had the phone people out to repair the line she had broken on Christmas Eve, it was when I learned that Miss T had used government equipment to put a tap on my phone. I now have a happy, healthy, long-term relationship of over 20 years. Anyway, I hope that this crazy ex story isn't too long. And remember, if you or anyone you know finds themselves in any toxic situation, there are ways out. For help, if you find yourself living in a domestic abuse situation, you can call the national hotline at 1-800-799-7233 or text BEGIN to 88788. It's very difficult to get out of an abusive relationship for many reasons. I had a support system that included my family, friends, and my therapist to help me make better choices for myself and my kids. I met Ariel on a crisp autumn evening. Her beauty was captivating and her laughter was infectious. We shared a sense of humor that made all the moments together feel like a scene from a romantic comedy. But beneath her charming exterior, there was a darkness that I couldn't see at first. Ariel had a temper, a fierce one. Initially, it was never directed at me. I was a loyal and calm man and always easygoing. As time passed, though, her anger found its way to me. She became controlling, her jealousy flaring up over the smallest things. One day, she saw me texting my sister and, in a fit of rage, took a knife and stabbed me in the arm, shouting, "You made me do that." That night, I found myself in the hospital, away from her. A nurse noticed my injuries, pulled me aside, and asked, "Is she hurting you?" Her eyes were filled with concern. I ended up confessing everything, and she revealed her own past of abuse. "She will kill you if you don't stay away from her," she warned, slipping me her number with a heart drawn next to it. "Just call me anytime, okay?" With the nurse's help, I managed to escape and press charges against Ariel. When the police came to arrest her, she tried to stab one of the officers, but was subdued with a taser. The last I heard, she was diagnosed with a sociopathic disorder and was living in a tent. Her life had spiraled into chaos. But the story doesn't end there. The night I filed the police report, that nurse that had helped me actually became my rock. We started dating and eventually we got married. We now have 3 kids and another on the way. She's the greatest thing that ever happened to me, proving that sometimes 2 broken people can find solace in each other. Yet that memory of Ariel does haunt me. Her promises to never hurt me again echo in my mind. A chilling reminder of how close I came to losing everything. I decided to share my story as a warning. Beware of those who seem perfect but hide a dark side. Vet your dates carefully, for the next time it might not just be a slap. It could be something far more sinister. Hey, so let me tell you about the time my friends and I made the worst decision ever. We were obsessed with investigating cemeteries and creepy places, but this one, it still gives me the chills. There's this old abandoned house right next to one of the cemeteries we used to visit, and of course, we had to check it out. So, we get there, and the first thing that hits us is the smell. It's like something died in there, and probably did. But, we were 16 and stupid. So instead of running away like normal people, we went inside. I don't even know what we were thinking. The house was exactly what you'd expect. Dark, dusty, and creepy. The floor creaked with every step, and there was this huge pentagon on the floor. And on the ceiling, too. It was like someone had been practicing some weird rituals. None of us had ever seen symbols like the ones drawn all over the place. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and my EMF meter, it was going off like crazy. I knew something was wrong right then, but instead of leaving, we kept going deeper into the house. Jake pulled out the spirit box, and the moment it crackled to life, we all froze.
Help. I'm trapped. Help me.
The voice was faint, but clear enough. It felt like whoever or whatever was speaking was right there with us. My gut was screaming at us to get out of there. But then, Kyle being Kyle had to act all tough. He wanted to check it out. Of course, to show off. Probably thought he would win me over or something, which, spoiler alert, he didn't. He started heading down these old wooden stairs into the basement, and with every step he took, I just got more and more creeped out. His chances with me were basically vanishing each step. I mean, I wanted to yell at him, "Don't go," but he was already halfway down, and then when he reached the bottom, we heard him go, "What the hell?" He'd found these hooks hanging from the ceiling. The kind that are used to hang cows or something. And there was old dried blood underneath. That's when I knew we were way out of our path. Kyle was halfway through the basement when we heard him mutter, "What is that?" He stopped, shining his flashlight on the ground. His foot had hit something. I couldn't see from where I was standing, but I knew by the tone of his voice that it wasn't good. He crouched down, and that's when I heard him say, "It's a knife. I think it's covered in blood." My heart dropped and I yelled, "Don't touch that. Whatever you do, don't touch it. That's evidence. We've got to call the cops." I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He wanted to be the hero, but even Kyle wasn't that dumb. He backed away from it, and I felt a small wave of relief. We got out of there after that. I mean, we weren't even supposed to be in that house in the first place, but we couldn't just leave that knife behind. We had to tell someone. So we called the cops, gave them a vague story, and then got out of there as fast as we could. I kept hoping they would figure out whose blood it was. Or maybe, just maybe, it wasn't a person. Maybe it was some kind of sacrifice. I don't know, a rat, maybe? Poor rat. 2 days later, we actually went back. This time was during the day. We were curious. you know. We wanted to see what that creepy house looked like in the daylight. But when we got there, there was no house left to see, just a pile of ashes. It was still kind of smoking a little, like the fire had only just finished. I stood there staring at the ruins, trying to make sense of it. The house, the knife, everything was gone. And as we poked around in the ashes, we found something strange. A single tarot card. I flipped it over and, wouldn't you believe it, it was the death card. Out of all the cards it could have been, it just had to be that one. Now, I know a little bit about tarot. I've read enough to understand that the death card doesn't always mean something bad. It can be a sign of transformation, a new beginning. So, I like to think that maybe if there was a spirit trapped in that house, they're free now. Maybe the fire was their way out. I hope so, anyway, because our spirit box actually stayed silent the second time. As a young lady straight out of high school, I was filled with a mix of excitement and nerves as I headed to my first blind date at Queen Street Mall in Brisbane, Australia. It was one of my first dates ever, in fact, and I was pretty shy back then. I was eager to see how it would go. We had met in chat rooms, which was pretty new back in the 90s, and not like Tinder or anything. You couldn't even swipe. Chat rooms were like virtual hangouts with barely any photos, if any, making the whole experience quite thrilling. It's like that Love is Blind show, where they get engaged without seeing what each other look like first. I found the whole idea fun and mysterious. When I finally saw him in person, I was caught off guard. The only photo I had seen of him was a vague and outdated kind of fuzzy one, with him wearing a cap and sunglasses. I stood there staring at a guy now with long black hair and gothic attire. He had black lipstick and was wearing a shirt with 666 on it. Seeing that number, which is often associated with the devil, made me think he was a little creepy. I tried to push my unease aside and focus on the date, hoping maybe he was just misunderstood, as I myself was considered the weird, X-File-loving, sarcastic pet rat girl at school, and weird is usually very interesting to me. I figured the shirt was just to annoy his parents or something, which was totally understandable at that age. We started with a coffee at a cafe inside the mall. He seemed friendly at first, and we chatted casually. The mall was bustling, and the police presence with their patrols and the cop car parked in the middle gave that false sense of security. But then, out of nowhere, he made a chilling comment. Wouldn't it be so funny if we stole that policeman's gun and just shot everyone in here? My heart raced as the shock and fear set in. I quickly excused myself, saying that I needed to use the toilets. As I made my way to the restroom, my heart was pounding in my chest. I glanced around nervously, trying to spot him in the crowd. Inside the toilets, I was a bundle of nerves, unsure if he was waiting outside. I peered through a crack in the door, but there was no sign of him. The anxiety was overwhelming. Every sound made me jump. Footsteps, voices, even the hum of the lights felt like they were closing in on me. I knew I had to act fast. I took a deep breath, hoping he wouldn't come looking for me. When I felt it was safe, I slipped out and hurried down the hallway, my eyes darting around. I took a quick turn into the bus station, where I finally saw a bus pulling in. With a surge of relief, I leapt on, not daring to look back. The moment I was on that bus, I felt a wave of safety wash over me. Once I was safely away, I blocked him out and deleted everything about him. He never knew where I lived, so I felt secure. Looking back, I hope that he never did anything bad to anyone, And maybe he was just messing around with the weird sense of humor, but I got that yucky gut feeling that I always follow. I also regret not reporting him to the police, but in that moment, all I wanted was to get out as quickly as possible. It took me a while to go on another date after that, but eventually I did. Surprisingly, one ended up being the guy I would marry. Woohoo, go me. But yeah, always trust your gut and always meet somewhere in public.